A group of amateur folklorists investigating forgotten local legends travels to a secluded lake in the Himalayas, where an ancient, beautiful melody is said to lure the lost, only to discover the music hides a monstrous, insatiable hunger beneath its surface. Once upon a time, nestled in the bustling heart of Delhi, a small team of amateur folklorists ran a niche online channel called Forgotten Whispers. There was Rohan, 20s, the charismatic leader, driven by a thirst for unexplored myths. Priya, 20s, the meticulous researcher whose skepticism was as sharp as her intellect. Aryan, 20s, the tech-savvy cameraman and drone operator, always looking for the perfect shot. And Mira, 20s, the group's quiet artist whose vivid dreams often mirrored the very legends they investigated, a detail she kept largely to herself. Their latest obsession was a fragment of an old Kashmiri folk tale, Lyra's Lake, a remote body of water high in the Himalayas, rumored to be the source of a mesmerizing, unearthly melody that drew travelers to their doom. Priya, after weeks of poring over forgotten provincial archives and faded local maps, had pinpointed its likely location, a trek so arduous it ensured its continued isolation. The legend itself was sparse, speaking only of the song that takes and the deep embrace of Lyra. Rohan, ever the thrill-seeker, saw in it not just a story, but an adventure, a chance to prove the tangible existence of the truly terrifying. Priya, though cautious, was intrigued by the sheer lack of information, suggesting a deliberate attempt at suppression. Aryan was already envisioning the breathtaking yet unsettling drone shots over the untouched mountainous terrain, and Mira, a faint tremor running through her, had already sketched haunting images of half-submerged figures with elongated fingers reaching from dark waters, a vision born from a recent, particularly vivid nightmare. Their journey began with the familiar rumble of an old SUV, leaving the chaotic streets of Delhi behind for the winding, increasingly narrow roads leading into the lower Himalayas. The initial excitement gradually gave way to a palpable sense of isolation as the cellular network faded, replaced by the hushed whispers of the wind through ancient pines. The last village they passed was barely a collection of crumbling stone huts, its inhabitants giving them wary, almost pitying glances when they mentioned Lyra's Lake. An old stoic woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, pressed a small dried herb packet into Priya's hand, muttering something about protection from the calling. Priya, ever the skeptic, politely thanked her, but slipped the packet into her pocket. The ascent became steeper, the air thinner, and the silence more profound. They hiked for 2 grueling days, each step taking them further from civilization and deeper into a primal landscape that felt both majestic and foreboding. Aaron's drone captured sweeping vistas of snow-capped peaks and valleys shrouded in mist, but every now and then he noticed odd distortions in the feed, brief, shimmering rippled in the air that weren't optical illusions. Mira, walking quietly at the rear, occasionally stopped, her head cocked as if straining to hear something beyond the wind. She spoke little, but her eyes, wide and thoughtful, constantly scanned the ancient trees and shadowed ravines, as if expecting something to emerge. On the second night, camping by a roaring fire far from any human habitation, a faint, almost imperceptible sound drifted on the wind, a sustained, melancholic note, like a distant ethereal cello. Rohan dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on the rock formations, but Priya felt a prickle of unease. Mira, however, pulled her shawl tighter, her gaze fixed on the impenetrable darkness beyond the firelight, her earlier dream of reaching hands becoming unsettlingly vivid. On the 3rd day, after traversing a particularly treacherous ridge, they finally saw it. Lyra's Lake. It wasn't the sparkling azure blue they expected of a pristine mountain lake. Instead, it was a deep, almost inky black, reflecting the perpetually overcast sky like a dark mirror. A thick, unsettling mist clung to its surface, swirling lazily, obscuring the far shore. The air here was heavy, still, devoid of the usual mountain sounds of birds or rustling leaves. An unnatural silence enveloped the entire basin, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the sparse, stony ground. As they approached the water's edge, an undeniable, beautiful melody drifted across the lake. A single, sustained note, rich and pure, yet laced with an undeniable sorrow. It was the same sound they had heard the previous night, but now amplified, undeniable. It resonated not just in their ears, but deep within their chests. A strange pull that felt both comforting and profoundly unsettling. Rohan, momentarily speechless, simply whispered, "This is it. This is Lyra's lake." Priya, despite her apprehension, felt a surge of exhilaration, definitive proof. Aryan quickly launched his drone, sending it soaring over the black water, hoping to capture the source of the sound. Mira, however, didn't reach for her camera. She stood at the water's edge, her hand instinctively going to her throat, a choked gasp escaping her lips. Her eyes were fixed on something in the swirling mist, something no one else could see. A faint, shimmering silhouette just beneath the surface, moving with an eerie grace, like a dancer in the depths, its form elongated, inhumanly beautiful, and undeniably drawing them closer. The melody swelled, weaving an irresistible spell, a promise of eternal peace within its mournful embrace. And as the first episode fades, the drone feed suddenly glitches, then goes to static, leaving the team isolated and unaware of what truly lies beneath Lyra's deceptively serene surface.
The melody from Lyra's lake intensified, no longer merely a sound, but a physical presence, a vibrant hum that vibrated through their very bones. Rohan, exhilarated by the irrefutable evidence of the legend, felt an almost insatiable urge to get closer, to immerse himself in the source of such sublime beauty. He fumbled with his camera, trying to capture the elusive source of the sound, his usual focus on content now laced with a raw, primal curiosity. Priya, despite her scientific training, felt her rational mind slowly giving way to a strange, almost dreamlike state. The anxieties and logical warnings that had always served as her anchors began to fray at the edges, replaced by a profound sense of peace, a feeling that if she could just reach the center of that melody, all her worldly worries would dissolve. Aryan, frantically trying to regain control of his drone, found his fingers unresponsive, as if the air itself had thickened around him. The drone, now a tiny speck above the swirling mist, dipped and swayed erratically, mirroring the instability of his own mind. Mira, however, was the most affected. Her earlier vision of reaching hands solidified, becoming almost tangible. She saw shapes in the mist, not just faint outlines, but forms of slender, pale figures, their movements fluid and mesmerizing, their eyes, if they had any, filled with an ancient, compelling sorrow. The melody wasn't just beautiful, It was a siren song, filled with the promise of understanding, of belonging, echoing the loneliness deep within her own soul. She felt an almost irresistible pull towards the dark water, a yearning to join the ethereal dancers she now clearly saw swirling just beneath the surface, their limbs impossibly long and graceful. The air around them grew noticeably colder, carrying a faint, sweet, decaying scent, like lilies left too long in stagnant water.
Rohan, overwhelmed by the hypnotic melody, took an impulsive step towards the water's edge, his gaze fixed on the mist. Priya, still caught in the song's spell, but with a faint spark of her analytical mind remaining, instinctively reached out and grabbed his arm, pulling him back. Her touch, a sudden jolt of human contact, momentarily broke Rohan's trance, bringing a flicker of confusion to his eyes. What was I doing?" he mumbled, shaking his head as if clearing cobwebs. But the reprieve was short-lived. The melody, as if angered by the interruption, intensified, vibrating with a new, insidious power. Aryan, still struggling with his drone controller, let out a choked gasp. His eyes, previously focused on the drone, now widened in terror, fixed on the lake. "Look!" he croaked, his voice raw with fear. The others followed his gaze. From within the thickest part of the mist, something broke the surface. Not a ripple, but a sudden, violent churn. A fleeting glimpse of something vast and dark, like the flank of an enormous, ancient creature, rippled just beneath the water. And then, with a horrifying, sucking sound, the drone, previously spiraling erratically, was suddenly, violently pulled down into the depths, vanishing without a trace, leaving only an expanding ripple on the black surface. The melody remained, but now it felt infused with a new, predatory hunger. Aryan, his face ashen, stumbled backward, pointing a trembling finger at the spot where his drone had disappeared. He began to hyperventilate, the shock of witnessing the unknown consuming him. The protective herb packet in Priya's pocket suddenly felt warm, almost hot against her skin. A faint, medicinal scent wafting from it, offering a momentary anchor against the overwhelming sense of dread.
With the drone gone, the team felt an even deeper sense of isolation. The vastness of the mountains, previously a source of awe, now felt like an inescapable cage. The melody continued its relentless assault, finding new ways to penetrate their defenses. Priya, now fighting actively against the song's influence, noticed subtle changes in her perception. The mist around the lake seemed to writhe, forming transient, unsettling shapes. Elongated limbs, distorted faces, eyes that glowed with a faint phosphorescent light. She started to hear whispers intertwined with the melody, faint at first, then growing clearer, like countless voices speaking just beyond the range of comprehension. They were not words she understood, but the intent was clear. Come closer, join us, relinquish control. Rohan, shaken but determined to document, found himself struggling to focus his camera, the lens constantly fogging, the footage coming out blurred and distorted, as if the lake itself was resisting being captured. He saw flickers of movement at the periphery of his vision, quick, fleeting glimpses of something pale and fast-moving just beneath the surface, too quick to fully discern. Mira, though, was completely immersed. She no longer saw the figures as mere illusions. They were real, beckoning, inviting. She saw the lake floor not as murky depths, but as a glittering, ethereal city, bathed in a strange internal luminescence, filled with the singing, dancing figures. Her own limbs felt heavy, her movements sluggish, as if she were already being pulled down into that beautiful, terrifying abyss. The scent of decaying flowers became stronger, cloying and sweet, and she felt a chilling dampness permeating her clothes, as if she had already stepped into the water. A desperate, chilling thought crossed Priya's mind. The music wasn't just luring them, it was changing them, preparing them for whatever lay in the deep.
As the day waned, the mist on Lyra's lake grew thicker, swallowing the last vestiges of light. The melody, now an overwhelming chorus, seemed to emanate not just from the lake, but from the very air around them, vibrating the ground beneath their feet. Aryan, still recovering from the drone incident, began to whimper, covering his ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate deep into his skull. Rohan, his face pale, tried to yell over the music, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive sound. He looked at Mira, who stood unnervingly still at the water's edge, her eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the swirling mist. Her lips were parted slightly, as if she were about to sing along. He reached out to grab her, but before he could, Mira took a slow, deliberate step into the dark, frigid water. The water rippled around her ankles, but she didn't react to the cold, only continued her slow, graceful progression deeper into the lake. Priya screamed her name, lunging forward to pull her back, but it was too late. As Mira's knees dipped below the surface, the melody swelled to an almost deafening crescendo, and from the depths of the black water a multitude of pale, elongated hands, impossibly thin and with nails like polished bone, rose from the mist, reaching towards Mira with an unsettling elegance. They were the very hands Mira had sketched, the very figures she had seen in her dreams. Mira didn't resist. Instead, a faint, blissful smile touched her lips as the hands gently, coaxingly began to pull her down, her form slowly disappearing beneath the dark surface of Lyra's lake. The melody now a triumphant, horrifying chorus, leaving Rohan, Priya, and the terrified Aryan utterly helpless at the water's edge, witnesses to a nightmare that had just begun to unfold.
The melody abruptly ceased, leaving behind an unbearable ringing silence that was almost as oppressive as the music itself. The absence of sound was deafening, highlighting the chilling reality of Mira's disappearance. Rohan and Priya stood frozen at the water's edge, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Aryan, now completely distraught, collapsed onto the stony ground, sobbing uncontrollably, his hands clamped over his ears as if trying to block out the lingering echoes of the melody and the horror of Mira's final, blissful smile. The mist on Lyra's lake seemed to thin slightly, revealing nothing but the inky black surface, reflecting the dull gray sky. There was no sign of Mira, no ripple, no trace she had ever been there, save for the horrifying images seared into their minds. Rohan, his usual confident demeanor shattered, dropped to his knees, his camera still clutched in his shaking hand, the screen displaying only static. He tried to speak, but his throat was tight with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Priya, though outwardly calmer, felt a cold dread seeping into her bones. Her scientific mind desperately searched for a rational explanation, but there was none. The herb packet in her pocket felt like a burning coal, a constant reminder of the old woman's warning, a warning she had so readily dismissed. The silence was punctuated only by Arian's ragged sobs and the distant mocking whisper of the wind, carrying no melody, only the stark reality of their isolation. The vastness of the mountains now felt like a crushing weight, sealing them in with their despair. Despite the overwhelming sense of futility, Rohan, driven by a desperate need to find Mira or at least a shred of evidence, began to frantically search the lake's perimeter. He called her name, his voice raw and hoarse, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. Bria, her mind now racing with a cold, desperate logic, joined him, systematically scanning the shoreline, looking for any sign, any disturbance. Arian, still whimpering, remained huddled on the ground, unable to move. As they searched, the mist on the lake began to shift again. But this time, it seemed to coalesce into faint, almost translucent forms that seemed to watch them from the depths. They were fleeting, barely there, but enough to send shivers down their spines. Rohan found Mira's small, waterproof backpack, abandoned near the water's edge. Inside, among her sketching supplies, was a half-finished drawing, a haunting depiction of long, slender hands reaching from dark water, almost identical to the sight they had just witnessed. The realization struck Rohan with a fresh wave of horror. Mira hadn't just seen them in dreams. She had known. Bria, checking the ground, found faint, almost imperceptible drag marks leading to the water, as if something had been pulled. The protective herb packet in her pocket continued to burn, urging her to find a way to use it, but how against such an entity? The sun began to dip below the mountain peaks, casting long, eerie shadows across the lake, making the already dark water seem even more menacing. They knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the core, that Mira was gone. But the thought of simply abandoning her, of leaving her to whatever lay in Lyra's lake, was unbearable.
As darkness enveloped the lake, forcing them to rely on their dwindling flashlight batteries, the oppressive silence was occasionally broken by faint, distant splashes from the center of the lake, rhythmic, almost playful sounds that filled them with dread. Rohan, desperate for answers, shone his powerful flashlight across the water, the beam cutting through the gloom. For a fleeting second, the light caught something near the center of the lake, something just barely breaking the surface. It was a fragment of wood, intricately carved, like a piece of an old, ornate boat. As Rohan focused, the beam then landed on something else, something far more horrifying. A human hand, pale and distorted, with impossibly long fingers, its nails strangely elongated and almost glowing in the faint light. It wasn't Mira's hand. It was too large, too alien. And it wasn't just one hand. As the light passed, they saw others, briefly, disturbingly, like limbs woven into the water itself, a horrifying tapestry of submerged forms. Priya, recognizing the craftsmanship on the wood fragment from her research on ancient Himalayan crafts, realized it was likely a piece of a forgotten ceremonial vessel, perhaps a barge of the lost. The chilling implication hit her. Lyra's lake wasn't just taking new victims. It was a graveyard, a collection of all those it had ever lured, their forms preserved or, perhaps, transformed by the malevolent entity within. The air grew colder,
and a faint, sweet, yet unmistakably putrid scent of decaying flesh mixed with the lilies asserting itself, making their stomachs churn. The whispers, which had been silent since Mira's disappearance, returned, not as a melody, but as a cacophony of choked gurgles and wet, sucking sounds from the depths, as if countless voices were struggling to speak from beneath the water.
The horrifying revelation fueled a desperate, primal urge to flee. There was no hope of rescue here. No logical explanation, only pure, unadulterated terror. Ron grabbed Arian, pulling him to his feet, and Priya, her face grim, led the way back along the treacherous path they had taken, the flashlights casting frantic, dancing shadows. The cold deepened, seeping into their very bones, and they could feel an unseen presence pressing in on them from all sides. The silence now broken by the horrifying gurgling from the lake, which seemed to follow them. As they scrambled over rocks and through dense undergrowth, the whispering grew louder, closer, seeming to emanate from the very trees around them. They could feel a palpable malevolence in the air, a sense of being hunted. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent jolts of fear through them. Arian, still in shock, stumbled repeatedly, his terror making him clumsy. Rohan, despite his own fear, pulled him along, pushing him forward. Priya, her hand clutching the still warm herb packet, knew that their only chance lay in escaping the lake's immediate influence. They were no longer just explorers, they were prey. The sun had long set, plunging the mountains into impenetrable darkness, making their desperate retreat even more perilous. They could hear the faint, horrifying splashes from the lake growing louder, closer, as if something was moving quickly towards the shore. The whispers intensified, now forming a low guttural hum that vibrated in the air around them, a chilling symphony of hunger. They knew with absolute certainty that Lyra's lake was not letting them go easily, and their only hope was to outrun the ancient, insatiable entity that now truly understood their presence.
The frantic retreat from Lyra's lake turned into a desperate, harrowing chase through the dark, unforgiving mountain terrain. The oppressive silence was now constantly shattered by the haunting sounds of their pursuit. The rhythmic, wet slosh, slosh of something moving through the water behind them was terrifyingly clear, growing closer with every strained breath they took. The air around them was thick with the sweet, putrid scent of decay clinging to their clothes and hair, a constant reminder of the lake's true nature. Rohan, pushing Arian ahead, kept glancing back, his flashlight beam cutting through the absolute darkness, catching fleeting glimpses of movement on the black surface of the lake, ripples that seemed to emanate from an impossibly fast, submerged entity. Priya, her heart pounding, tried to recall any folklore about warding off such creatures, but her mind was a jumbled mess of fear and the lingering echoes of the melody. The whispers, no longer confined to the lake, seemed to emanate from the very trees around them, disembodied voices speaking in a guttural language, almost like distorted gurgles, punctuated by wet, sickening sounds. Arian, utterly broken by terror, stumbled and fell frequently, his legs weak, his mind teetering on the edge of madness. Rohan, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate need to survive, would drag him up, forcing him to move, his own fear a tangible weight in the freezing mountain air. They felt an invisible pressure, a suffocating embrace that seemed to draw the warmth from their bodies, the ancient malevolence of Lyra's lake asserting its will. The climb away from the lake, previously arduous, was now an impossible feat of strength and will. Every step a monumental effort against an unseen yet undeniably present force.
As they desperately clawed their way up a steep rocky incline, Aryan, in a moment of sheer panic, let out a piercing scream. His legs buckled and he pointed a trembling finger back towards the lake. It's coming out, he choked, his voice barely a whisper. Rohan and Priya spun around, their flashlights cutting through the mist still lingering closer to the water, and then they saw it. Breaking the surface of Lyra's lake slowly, impossibly, was a form that defied all natural understanding. It wasn't a monster of scales or teeth. It was a being of liquid shadow and shimmering translucence, vaguely humanoid, but impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and slender, ending in impossibly long fingers that seemed to stretch into infinity. Its skin seemed to ripple and flow like the water itself, and where its face should have been, there was only a swirling vortex of dark water, from which the haunting, beautiful melody now emanated directly, pure and intoxicating, yet laden with unimaginable malice. Surrounding this central figure were countless smaller, paler forms, their movements fluid and graceful, like dancers, their skeletal hands reaching out, almost identical to Mira's final sketch. These were the children of the lake, the victims transformed into part of the entity, their voices contributing to the horrifying chorus. The sweet, putrid scent of decay became overwhelming, an assault on their senses. Priya, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization, understood. The Lyra of the legend wasn't a person or a spirit. It was the lake itself, a living, ancient entity, an insatiable siren that consumed all who dared to listen to its song, assimilating them into its monstrous, beautiful form.
Knowing they couldn't outrun it, and with the entity now fully emerged from the lake, towering over them, Rohan, in a last, desperate gamble, remembered the old woman's herb packet. He fumbled for it in Priya's pocket, his fingers shaking. "The old woman," he gasped. "She said, protection from the calling. There has to be a way." Priya, her mind now clear with a chilling certainty, looked at the packet. "It's not just protection," she whispered. "It's to break the illusion, to sever the connection." She tore open the packet. Inside were dried herbs, a small polished stone, and a tiny, almost invisible, silver thread. The air immediately sharpened, the putrid smell momentarily receding as the strong, earthy scent of the herbs filled their nostrils. The melody, which had been engulfing them, seemed to falter, a momentary dissonance rippling through its beautiful notes. The large, shimmering entity recoiled slightly, its fluid form rippling as if in pain. Taking a deep breath, Priya, remembering fragmented folk tales about banishing spirits, crushed the herbs in her hand, sprinkling them towards the creature, while simultaneously holding out the small stone. Rohan, despite his terror, instinctively grabbed the silver thread and, remembering the knowledge unveiled, truth spoken from his past research, shouted towards the creature, "You are not Lyra. You are a devourer, a monster hidden by beauty." His voice, though trembling, seemed to pierce the pervasive melody. The entity shrieked, a sound not of a voice but of countless voices struggling, a horrifying symphony of agony and rage, as its fluid form began to shimmer violently, almost dissolving. The smaller, ethereal figures around it recoiled, their graceful movements becoming erratic, panic.
The effect was instantaneous and devastating. As Rohan's words, amplified by the silver thread, hit the entity and Priya's herbs filled the air, the beautiful, haunting melody of Lyra's lake abruptly fractured, dissolving into a cacophony of distorted screams and wet, tearing sounds. The magnificent, shimmering entity writhed, its form collapsing in on itself, drawing back into the black depths of the lake with a horrifying, sucking noise that sounded like 1,000 voices being silenced at once. The smaller, ethereal figures vanished entirely, dissipating into the mist. The air cleared, the putrid smell gone, replaced by the crisp, cold mountain air. The oppressive cold lifted. The mist on the lake's surface swirled violently for a few moments, then settled, revealing nothing but the inky black water, still and ominous, but devoid of any visible presence. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper and more profound than any silence they had ever experienced, a stark contrast to the relentless song that had almost claimed them. Rohan, Priya, and Aryan, exhausted, trembling, and deeply traumatized, slowly backed away from the lake. They didn't speak. They didn't look back. They simply turned and began the long, arduous journey back down the mountain, their minds irrevocably scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. When they finally reached civilization days later, their faces pale and gaunt, they spoke little of their experience. Their online channel, Forgotten Whispers, falling silent. The footage Rohan had managed to salvage was fragmented, distorted, and ultimately unwatchable, but the images were seared into their memories. Lyra's lake remained, a dark, silent mirror in the Himalayas, its deceptive beauty now forever tainted by the knowledge of what lay beneath. And sometimes, on clear, cold nights, a lone, mournful note could still be heard drifting on the wind. From the distant mountains, a faint echo of the sunken song, a chilling reminder that some ancient entities, even when banished, never truly forget those who dared to disrupt their slumber.